The scent of aged linseed oil and turpentine clung to the air in the restoration studio, a perfume of ghosts and forgotten time. Clara Hayes, 23, held her breath, her hand suspended over the canvas. The brush in her fingers, finer than a whisper, held a single speck of pigment meant to fill a microscopic crack in the cheek of a 17th-century noblewoman. In this silent, climate-controlled room, high above the frenetic pulse of Manhattan, she was not an intern from Queens. She was a conduit to the past, a surgeon of beauty. Her focus was absolute, a meditative state that walled off the gnawing emptiness that defined her life outside these hallowed walls. The woman in the portrait stared back with melancholic eyes, her painted lips sealed over centuries of secrets. Clara felt a strange kinship with her, a shared existence of being seen but never truly known, a beautiful object trapped in a gilded frame. If you want to discover how this forgotten canvas will shatter her world, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Clara herself was a study in muted tones, a figure designed to blend into the background. Her mousy brown hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her clothes were practical, chosen for comfort and invisibility rather than style. As an art restorer intern at the prestigious Sterling Arts Consortium, she moved through halls of unimaginable wealth with the quiet deference of a pilgrim in a cathedral. Her colleagues, with their art school pedigrees and casual talk of European summers, barely registered her presence. She was simply the girl with the steady hands, the one who could spend 12 hours coaxing life back into a faded masterpiece without complaint. This anonymity was her armor, a necessary shield in a world she was permitted to serve but never to join, a constant, painful reminder of the chasm between her life and the one she so carefully preserved on canvas. Every evening, the descent from the ivory tower of the Sterling building back into the gritty reality of the city felt like a form of emotional whiplash. The gleaming marble lobby gave way to the screeching, crowded chaos of the subway, where she became just another weary face in the river of humanity flowing toward the outer boroughs. This was where the void truly opened up inside her, surrounded by the vibrant, messy lives of strangers, lovers whispering, friends laughing, parents scolding their children. Clara felt a profound and aching solitude. Her life was a series of obligations, a path laid out for her by circumstance, not by choice. She was an observer, her nose pressed against the glass of a life she couldn't touch, her heart a quiet, hollow drum beating a rhythm of duty and resignation. Her fear of intimacy was a legacy, a poison passed down from her mother. It wasn't a conscious choice or a religious conviction, but a deep, cellular terror. She carried the memory of her childhood home like a scar, the heavy silence after her father left for the night, the scent of her mother's cheap perfume failing to mask the smell of stale whiskey and resignation. She'd watched her mother's body become a currency in a loveless, transactional marriage, her spirit slowly eroding with each hollow touch. From this, Clara had built a fortress around herself. To her, the body was a sanctuary, the last sovereign territory of the self. To give it away without a genuine, soul-deep connection would be the ultimate act of self-betrayal, a surrender to the same quiet desperation that had consumed her mother. Her virginity was not a prize to be won, but a shield to be held. The shrill buzz of her phone shattered the sacred silence of the studio, a digital intrusion from the world she tried so hard to keep at bay. It was a message from her mother, 3 words that made the floor drop out from under her. Matthew is worse. The delicate brush fell from her numb fingers, leaving a tiny, insignificant smudge on the protective border of the canvas. The noblewoman's painted eyes seemed to watch her with pity. The journey home to Queens was a blur of panic and prayer. Their small apartment, always smelling faintly of antiseptic and anxiety, felt smaller and more suffocating than ever. The medical equipment surrounding her younger brother's bed looked like a collection of malevolent chrome insects, a constant humming reminder of the disease that was methodically stealing him from her, piece by precious piece. Matthew was her anchor and her abyss. At 17, he possessed a soul far older than his years, trapped in a body that was failing him with cruel efficiency. Clara spent her nights by his bedside, reading to him from worn paperbacks or simply holding his hand, its warmth a fragile reassurance against the cold fear that lived permanently in her stomach. She saw the flicker of his dreams in his sleeping eyes and felt the crushing weight of their reality. The doctors spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about experimental treatments, Swiss clinics, and figures that sounded like astronomical equations. $750,000. The number echoed in the quiet moments, a monstrous, insurmountable wall between her brother and his future. Her love for him was a fierce, protective fire, but she knew that love alone couldn't buy a miracle. Late that night, unable to sleep, Clara returned to the deserted Sterling building, needing the solace of her work. The security guard, accustomed to her obsessive hours, waved her through with a nod. In the silent studio, bathed in the soft glow of a single work lamp, the portrait seemed different, more intimate. Her eyes traced the artist's signature, then the small brass plaque on the frame. From the private collection of Damien Sterling, the name hung in the air, a symbol of a world of absolute power, a world where a sum like $750,000 was a casual expense. He was the owner of this beauty, the unseen king of this empire, a man as remote and untouchable as a distant star. And in that moment, a terrifying, desperate thought began to form, a seed of transgression taking root in the barren soil of her despair. The journey home was a daily act of psychological decompression, a violent shedding of a skin that never quite fit. As the subway car plunged into the dark tunnels beneath the East River, the hushed reverence of the Sterling Consortium was violently replaced by the raw, unfiltered symphony of the city, the screech of steel on steel, the cacophony of a dozen languages, the oppressive humidity of too many bodies pressed too close. It all conspired to strip away the illusion of control she curated in the studio. Here she was anonymous again, but it was a different kind of invisibility. It was the insignificance of a single, tired cell in the city's sprawling organism. She watched a young couple share headphones, their heads leaning together in a bubble of private intimacy, and a wave of profound, aching loneliness washed over her, cold and absolute. Her apartment building in Astoria stood as a monument to weary endurance. The red brick facade was stained with decades of city grime, and the lobby smelled perpetually of damp mail and fried onions. Every detail was a testament to a life lived on the margins of financial stability. The elevator's rattling groan, the flickering fluorescent light. In the hallway that cast long dancing shadows, the thin walls that offered no privacy from the arguments and celebrations of her neighbors. This was her reality, a world away from the gleaming, climate-controlled silence where she spent her days. The contrast was a physical ache in her chest, a constant grinding reminder of the chasm between the life she was paid to preserve for others and the one she was forced to live herself, a life of managed decay. Inside, the apartment was a shrine to her mother's quiet desperation. Elena Hayes existed in a state of suspended animation, her life playing out in the flickering blue light of the television screen. She sat on the worn floral sofa, a glass of cheap Chardonnay sweating onto a coaster, her eyes glazed over as she watched black and white movie stars fall in love. The air was thick with the scent of lavender air freshener, failing to mask the underlying notes of stale wine and regret. Her mother's presence was a form of passive oppression, a constant unspoken judgment on Clara's choices. She didn't need to say the words. Her weary sighs and the slump of her shoulders communicated everything: disappointment, fear, and the crushing weight of a life unlived. The kitchen table was their battlefield, littered with the white envelopes of their enemy. Medical bills, collection notices, and stark red warnings lay scattered across the chipped formica surface. "The hospital called again," Elena would murmur, not looking at Clara, her focus on swirling the wine in her glass. "Mrs. Leone's son, the one who works at the garage, he asked about you. He's a good boy, steady." The suggestion was always there, hanging in the air between them, the idea that Clara's salvation and theirs lay in a practical union. It was a subtle, constant pressure to trade her future for their security, to follow the same transactional path that had hollowed out her mother's soul. Each mention was another brick in the wall that was slowly closing in around Clara. Matthew's room was the only place in the apartment that held any light. It was a pocket universe of defiance against the encroaching darkness of his illness. The walls were covered in posters of nebulae and distant galaxies, and his shelves overflowed with books on theoretical physics and fantasy epics. The whirring and beeping of the medical equipment was a discordant soundtrack to this sanctuary, a constant reminder of the body that held his brilliant mind captive. He was propped up against a mountain of pillows, his frame painfully thin, but his eyes were alive with a fierce intelligence that belied his physical weakness. When Clara sat by his bed and read to him, their shared world of stories was the only escape they had, a fragile boat on a vast dark ocean of fear. The nightly ritual of his care was a meditation in love and terror. Clara's hands, which by day could trace the delicate craquelure of a centuries-old masterpiece, moved with the same preternatural steadiness as she measured his medications and adjusted the tubes that sustained him. Each task was performed with a focused grace that masked the frantic prayer in her heart. She would watch the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest on the monitor, her own breath catching in her throat with every slight irregularity. She saw the slow, cruel progression of the disease in the increased tremor of his hands and the pale, translucent quality of his skin. This was her true work, a restoration project far more vital and infinitely more terrifying than any painting, a battle she was fighting with nothing but her own fragile hope. Later, in the suffocating quiet of the living room, Clara would sit in the dark, the city lights of Manhattan a distant, mocking constellation across the river. She would look down at her own hands, the source of her only marketable skill, and feel a surge of bitter futility. She could mend the broken beauty of the past. She could give eternal life to inanimate objects, but she was powerless to stop the slow, methodical destruction of the person she loved most in the world. Her talent felt like a cruel joke. She was a conservator of luxury, a handmaiden to the whims of the wealthy, while in her own life, the most precious thing she had was disintegrating before her eyes, and the cure was locked away behind a vault of money she could never hope to earn. The pressure from the outside world was a constant low hum of judgment. A phone call from her aunt would inevitably turn into a lecture cloaked in concern. "Your mother worries, Clara. You're 23. You should be thinking about settling down. It's not right for a young woman to carry all this on her own." The words were always the same, a chorus of traditional expectations that saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved through marriage. They couldn't comprehend her devotion to her work or the fierce protective wall she had built around her heart. To them, she was an asset being squandered, her youth and potential fading while she clung to the hopeless cause of her brother and the impractical dream of her art. Sometimes, the scent of her mother's wine would trigger a memory so sharp it felt like a physical blow. She would see her father, a large silent man who moved through their small apartment like a storm cloud. She would remember the way her mother's voice would change when he came home, becoming smaller, more brittle. She remembered the sound of his wallet hitting the kitchen counter, a dull thud that signified the payment for another week of her mother's hollow smiles and feigned affection. It was a marriage built on a grim transaction, a slow erosion of spirit in exchange for financial security. That memory was the bedrock of her fear, the reason she guarded her body and her heart with such vigilance. It was a legacy of quiet horror she refused to inherit. Lying in her narrow bed, the city's endless nocturnal hum seeping through her window, Clara felt the true weight of her imprisonment. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. The number was a brand on her consciousness, $750,000. It was an abstraction, a figure so vast it felt like a fiction. It was the price of a life, her brother's life, and it existed in a world she could only glimpse through the reinforced glass of the Sterling building. The desperate thought that had first bloomed in the studio returned, now fully formed and monstrous. It was a plan born of absolute despair, a proposed sacrifice that would require her to shatter the very core of her identity. It was a path to salvation that felt indistinguishable from damnation. The air in the restoration studio, usually a calm sea of focused silence, suddenly crackled with an invisible electricity. It began as a subtle shift, a change in barometric pressure that Clara felt in her bones before she heard it. The hushed whispers from the senior conservators ceased, replaced by a tense, reverent stillness. Then came the sound, the confident, rhythmic click of expensive leather shoes on the polished concrete floor. It was a sound that didn't belong in their quiet sanctuary, a sound that announced the arrival of power itself. Clara's focus on the canvas wavered, the painted noblewoman's eyes seeming to widen in shared apprehension. A presence had entered the room, a center of gravity so immense that everything and everyone was being pulled into its orbit, and She instinctively knew who it was without even looking up from her delicate work. She resisted the urge to turn, anchoring herself to the millimeter of canvas under her brush, but the presence moved closer, a shadow falling over her workstation, eclipsing the soft glow of her lamp. When she finally lifted her gaze, she found herself looking not at a face, but at the immaculate cut of a charcoal grey suit that seemed to have been woven from shadow and money. Her eyes traveled upward, past a stark white shirt and a perfectly knotted silk tie, to a face that was a masterpiece of cold geometry. Damien Sterling was taller and more imposing than any photograph had suggested. His features were sharp, aristocratic, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, deep and turbulent, holding a profound, ancient coldness that seemed to suck all the warmth from the air around him. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own. Making. The name echoed in her mind, trailing whispers and legends she'd overheard in the consortium's sterile hallways. Damien Sterling, the collector of broken souls, a man who acquired beauty with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business dealings. They said he was a ghost in his own empire, a hermit king who rarely descended from his penthouse office, communicating through terse emails and terrified subordinates. They spoke of a tragedy years ago, a beautiful fiancée, a sculptor, lost in a terrible accident. Since then he had sealed himself off, his only passion reserved for the inanimate, for the perfect, silent beauty of art that could never betray him or leave him. And now, this ghost was standing right beside her. He moved with a deliberate, unnerving grace, his attention fixed solely on the painting she was restoring. He didn't acknowledge her presence, not at first. Instead, he leaned in, his gaze sweeping over the canvas with an intensity that felt more intimate than a touch. Clara could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body, smell the subtle, clean scent of expensive cologne, sandalwood and something sharp, like winter air. His proximity was an invasion, a violation of the sterile bubble she maintained around herself. The world had shrunk to the space between them, a space charged with the unspoken history of the painting and the living, breathing enigma of the man who owned it. She held her breath, feeling pinned by his focus. A specimen under a microscope, her every tiny, precise movement suddenly feeling clumsy and inadequate under his silent scrutiny. Her left eye, he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was not a question nor a greeting, but a statement of fact, delivered with absolute authority. The original artist used a trace of lapis lazuli mixed with the umber. It's almost impossible to detect without spectrometry, but it's what gives her gaze its melancholic depth. Are you using the correct compound for the in-painting? His words were precise, clinical, a test disguised as an observation. He was not just the owner, he was an expert, a connoisseur who knew the soul of his collection down to its chemical composition. He was challenging her, demanding she prove her worthiness to touch something he so clearly treasured, and in that moment she felt the immense weight of his expectations settle upon her shoulders. Clara's throat felt tight, the words caught, behind a wall of sudden anxiety. She was used to being invisible, a pair of steady hands, not a voice, but his question hung in the air, demanding an answer. She cleared her throat, the small sound loud in the charged silence. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended, yet unwavering. "I cross-referenced the original pigment analysis from the acquisition report. I've custom-blended a compound using synthetic ultramarine and a base of raw umber and bone black to match the refractive index and aging properties." The lapis was a signature of the artist's studio, a way of marking his most personal works. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, her professional pride overriding her fear, determined to show him she was not just a technician, but a guardian of the art's history. For a long moment, he said nothing. His stormy eyes shifted from the painting to her face, and then, with an unnerving intensity, down to her hands. He watched her fingers, poised, delicately over the canvas, the fine-tipped brush held with a surgeon's steadiness. It was a gaze that saw more than just her skill. It was analytical, dissecting, and yet, for a fleeting instant, Clara saw something else flicker in their depths, a ghost of an emotion too quick to name. It wasn't desire, not in any conventional sense. It was a look of profound, almost painful recognition, as if in her focused devotion he saw an echo of a passion he had once known, a phantom limb he could still feel aching. The look made her skin prickle, feeling seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely captivating. He broke the silence, his voice softer now, laced with a new, unexpected note of melancholy. He gestured toward the noblewoman's face on the canvas. She was painted less than a year before she was lost at sea during a storm. The patron who commissioned it never accepted her death. He kept the portrait in his study until the day he died, as if waiting for her to walk out of the frame. The words were not meant for her, not really. They were a quiet reflection, a glimpse into the wound he carried. He was speaking of the painting, but Clara heard the story of his own loss, the tragedy of his lost fiancée. In that moment, the powerful, intimidating CEO vanished, replaced by a man haunted by beauty, a collector of broken souls, because his own had been shattered long ago. As quickly as the crack in his armor had appeared, it was sealed shut. Damien Sterling straightened up, the cool, impersonal mask of the billionaire snapping back into place. The brief, fragile moment of connection evaporated, leaving the air cold and sharp once more. "See that it is done perfectly," he commanded, the words clipped and final. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a dismissal that was as absolute as a slamming door. Without another glance at her or the painting, he turned and walked away, the sound of his expensive shoes receding, leaving a profound and unsettling silence in his wake. The other conservators, who had been frozen in place, slowly began to breathe again, the studio's normal rhythm cautiously resuming. But for Clara, the silence he left behind was louder than any sound. She remained motionless for a long time after he was gone, her hand still suspended over the canvas. The air where he had stood still seemed to hold the imprint of his presence, the faint scent of his cologne, a lingering ghost. She looked down at the noblewoman's face, at the melancholic eyes she had been so carefully restoring. But she no longer saw just a 17th-century aristocrat. She saw a stand-in for another lost love, a vessel for a powerful man's unending grief. The painting was no longer just a project. It was a conduit, a direct link to the enigmatic, wounded heart of Damien Sterling. A dangerous curiosity had taken root inside her, a fascination with the darkness she had glimpsed behind his cold, stormy eyes, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning. The quiet hum of the climate control system in the restoration studio was no longer a comfort to Clara. It was the sound of a ticking clock. In the days following their first encounter, Damien Sterling became a recurring phantom in her sanctuary. He would appear without warning, a silent, imposing figure in his perfectly tailored suits, moving through the space with the predatory grace of a panther. He never spoke directly to her again, but she felt the weight of his gaze constantly. It was a physical pressure on the back of her neck, a silent scrutiny that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. He would stand for long, unnerving periods behind her, his attention fixed on her work, his stillness a stark contrast to the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. The studio had transformed from a refuge into a cage she now shared with its owner. Her colleagues reacted to his presence with a mixture of terror and fawning deference, their professional composure dissolving into nervous energy. They would offer unsolicited updates on their projects, their voices unnaturally high, while he would respond with a curt nod or a single, cutting remark that would leave them flustered. Yet, with Clara, he maintained his unnerving silence. This selective lack of engagement was a communication in itself, a form of intense, focused pressure that set her apart from everyone else. She tried to lose herself in the work, to channel her anxiety into the steady, microscopic movements of her brush, but her hands, once so reliable, now carried a faint tremor whenever his shadow fell across her table. Her focus, once her greatest shield, had been irrevocably breached by his silent, powerful presence. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the tension that had been simmering between them finally found a physical catalyst. Damien was leaning over her shoulder, examining a section of the portrait where the noblewoman's lace collar met the delicate skin of her throat. The air was thick with the scent of rain, ozone, and his subtle, expensive cologne. The artist used a single hair brush for these threads, he murmured, his voice a low rumble so close to her ear that it sent a shiver down her spine. As he pointed to a nearly invisible detail, the back of his hand, cool and firm, brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it felt like a brand. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through her, a shocking, invasive heat that made her gasp, the sound swallowed by the quiet of the room. He recoiled instantly, pulling his hand back as if he had touched a live wire. Clara's eyes flew to his, and for a split second, the impenetrable mask of the billionaire was gone. She saw not coldness, but a raw, unguarded shock, a flicker of confusion and something else, something that looked unnervingly like fear. It was the look of a man who had unexpectedly stumbled upon a feeling he had long ago buried. The moment stretched into an eternity, the air between them crackling with the unspoken. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. His eyes became glacial, his posture rigid. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the studio, leaving Clara with a racing pulse and the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. A phantom sensation that refused to fade. The incident shattered a carefully constructed boundary, and in the days that followed, their interactions shifted. The silence was replaced by a new, more dangerous form of engagement. He began to speak to her, his questions probing beyond the technical aspects of her work. "Why do you think he painted her with her gaze averted?" he asked one evening, his voice a quiet intrusion into her concentration. "Is it modesty, or is it a secret she's keeping from the viewer?" He was no longer just observing. He was inviting her into a dialogue, a shared exploration of the painting's hidden emotional landscape. He was asking for her interpretation, her feelings, and in doing so, he was subtly, skillfully, drawing out the parts of herself she kept most carefully hidden from the world. Clara, initially cautious, found herself unable to resist the pull of these conversations. Art was the only language in which she felt truly fluent, and here was someone who understood its grammar, its poetry, its soul. She spoke of the melancholy in the brushstrokes, the story of loss embedded in the composition, the way the light seemed to mourn the subject it illuminated. She was talking about the painting, but the words felt deeply personal, confessions disguised as art criticism. He would listen with a fierce, unwavering intensity, his stormy eyes fixed on her face, making her feel seen in a way that was both profoundly validating and utterly terrifying. She was revealing herself to this cold, powerful man, and the most frightening part was that she found herself wanting to. This strange, intoxicating connection at work was a stark, painful contrast to the grim reality that awaited her at home. Matthew's condition was a constant low-grade fever of anxiety in her life, but now it began to spike. The doctor's calls became more frequent, their language more urgent. The stack of unpaid medical bills on the kitchen table grew into a small, menacing mountain of white paper. Her mother's hints about finding a good man to take care of her became less subtle, her weary sighs filling the small apartment with a suffocating sense of failure. Clara felt as if she were living a double life, the nascent, complex woman awakening in Damien Sterling's presence, and the dutiful, terrified daughter drowning in a sea of debt and despair. The chasm between these two selves was widening into an impossible, soul-tearing abyss. A profound and corrosive guilt began to eat at her. How could she allow herself these moments of thrilling, forbidden connection with Damien while her brother was fighting for every breath? The memory of his voice, the phantom heat of his touch, felt like a betrayal. He was a billionaire, a man for whom $750,000 was a rounding error, while that same sum represented the entire world to her. The desire she was beginning to feel, a confusing, terrifying flutter in the pit of her stomach whenever he was near, felt like a moral failing, a selfish indulgence in the face of her family's suffering. She was starting to crave the attention of the very embodiment of the cold, transactional world she despised, and she hated herself for it. The conflict reached a breaking point one evening when she was working late, the only person left in the vast, silent consortium. Seeking a moment of peace, she wandered into a private gallery she knew he frequented, a dimly lit space filled with modern sculptures. She found him there, standing before a chaotic, violent piece of welded steel that looked like a scream given form. He was not the formidable CEO she knew. His shoulders were slumped, the impeccable lines of his suit seeming to hang on a frame suddenly burdened by an invisible weight. He was utterly still, his profile etched in shadow, his gaze fixed on the sculpture with an expression of such profound, naked grief that it stole the air from her lungs. He seemed to sense her presence, turning his head slowly. The coldness was absent from his eyes, replaced by a deep, hollow weariness. "It was hers," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its usual authority. "The sculptor, my fiancée. This was the last piece she was working on before the accident." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't have to. The story was there in the raw pain on his face, in the way he looked at the twisted metal as if it were a sacred relic. In that moment, the powerful, intimidating myth of Damien Sterling dissolved, and she saw only a man irrevocably broken by loss, who had surrounded himself with inanimate beauty because the living kind had been too cruelly ripped away from him. A wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a physical blow crashed over her. It was a dangerous, unwanted emotion that complicated everything. He was no longer just a symbol of the wealth that could save her brother. He was a person, a man carrying a wound as deep and as defining as her own. This shared geography of pain created a new, terrifying bridge between them. It made the desire she felt for him seem less like a shallow infatuation and more like a profound elemental recognition. He was not just a cold collector, he was a fellow soul in mourning, and this realization, this sudden, intimate glimpse into his darkness, made him infinitely more dangerous to the careful fortress she had built around her own heart. The next day, the call she had been dreading finally came. It was the hospital. Matthew had been rushed to the emergency room after a severe respiratory episode. Clara stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, the doctor's words washing over her in a cold, clinical tide. "He's stable for now, but his lungs are deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The clinic in Switzerland. Clara, if there's any way, now is the time. We are running out of options." The world tilted on its axis. The abstract number, the monstrous figure of $750,000, was no longer a future problem. It was an immediate, life-or-death ultimatum. The time for hope, for prayers, for incremental solutions was over. She walked out of the hospital and into the cold night air, her body numb, her mind terrifyingly clear. All the fear, the guilt, the moral hesitation, it was all burned away by the white-hot certainty of her desperation. There was only one path. There was only one person in the world who possessed the power to grant her brother life, and she now understood the currency he dealt in. It wasn't just money. It was beauty, passion, and pieces of the soul. The image of Damien standing before the sculpture, his face a mask of grief, flashed in her mind. He collected broken things. Perhaps, she thought with a chilling sense of clarity, he would be interested in acquiring one more. The decision settled in her bones, not as a surrender, but as a declaration of war. She would fight for her brother with the only weapon she had left. She would take the most sacred, untouched part of herself, the very core of her identity, the sanctuary she had guarded with such fierce devotion, and she would place it on the negotiating table. It was a horrifying, soul-shattering act of self-immolation, a deliberate step into the transactional world she had always feared. She would become her mother's daughter in the most profound and tragic way imaginable, but she would do it on her own terms, for a price that mattered more than her own soul. Returning to her small apartment, she moved with a strange, dreamlike purpose. She showered, the water sluicing over her skin, feeling like a ritualistic cleansing before a sacrifice. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, at her wide, fearful eyes, the pale set of her mouth. She saw the girl she had been, the one who believed in the sanctity of connection, the one who was terrified of intimacy, and she said goodbye to her. Because the woman who was about to walk out into the night and travel to Damien Sterling's penthouse was someone else entirely. She was a seller, and she had an item of unique, unblemished value to offer. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now eclipsed by a terrifying resolve. The internal battle was over. The dilemma had been solved by the brutal mathematics of life and death. Desire and duty, which had been warring factions within her, now merged into a single, monstrous purpose. Her burgeoning feelings for Damien were no longer a source of guilt, but a tool to be leveraged. She understood him now, in a way she hadn't before. She understood his hunger for things that were pure, for beauty that was untouched by the world's ugliness. She would offer him a masterpiece of her own making, her innocence. As she stepped into the elevator of his gleaming, opulent building, rising silently toward the heavens where he lived, she felt a profound and devastating sense of calm. She was no longer Clara Hayes, the quiet art restorer. She was an instrument of her brother's salvation. She was about to make a deal with the devil, but she would walk into his lair with her head held high. The price would be her body, her integrity, the very essence of who she was. But in the cold, cruel calculus of her desperation, it was a price she was finally, irrevocably willing to pay. Her quiet life was over. The transgression was about to begin. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a glass and steel cage lifting her toward the heavens. Damian Sterling's penthouse was less a home than a statement of absolute dominion over the city that sprawled beneath it like a carpet of shattered diamonds. The space was a gallery of cold perfection. Minimalist furniture, polished concrete floors, and walls adorned with art that pulsed with a silent, tortured energy. It was a beautiful, sterile mausoleum for a living man. Clara walked across the vast living area, her cheap shoes making no sound, her heart a frantic drum against the cage of her ribs. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a dark silhouette against the glittering abyss of the Manhattan skyline. He hadn't turned, but she knew he was aware of her. Every breath, a predator sensing the arrival of its willing prey in the heart of its own territory. She stopped a few feet behind him, the rehearsed words feeling like ash in her dry mouth. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, whiskey, and his own unique, clean fragrance that she now associated with a terrifying form of power. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a fragile thread in the immense silence, yet it did not tremble. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Sterling," she began, the words stark and brutal in the quiet opulence. "I want a deal." He turned then, his face half in shadow, his stormy eyes pinning her in place. "My brother's life, for the only thing of value I possess." A beat of silence stretched, taut and agonizing. "Devour my bodies, and in return I'll forget I ever had a soul." The proposition landed between them, a grenade of desperation and sacrifice, its ugliness a stark contrast to the curated beauty of the room. His reaction was a profound, unnerving stillness. There was no flicker of cynical amusement, no cold transactional nod of acceptance she had braced herself for. He simply watched her, his gaze sweeping over her face with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back the layers of her resolve to see the terrified, desperate girl beneath. In his eyes she saw not lust or pity, but a flicker of something she could only describe as horrified recognition. It was as if her raw, brutal offer had struck a dissonant chord within. Him, an echo of a bargain with fate he himself had made and lost long ago. He saw the totality of her sacrifice, the self-immolation in her words, and for a moment, the untouchable billionaire looked shaken, as if her purity was a light so bright it hurt his eyes to look at it directly. He broke the spell of silence by moving to a sleek chrome bar, his movements deliberate and unnervingly graceful. He poured 2 glasses of a dark, amber liquid, the clink of the heavy crystal the only sound in the room. He walked back to her and extended one of the glasses. His fingers brushed against hers as she took it, a spark of cold fire that shot straight up her arm. It was not a gesture of seduction, but of ritual, a shared sacrament before a desecration. He didn't speak a word of acceptance. He didn't need to. The pact was sealed in this silent, solemn offering. He lifted his own glass in a gesture that was not quite a toast, his eyes holding hers, and in their depths she saw a shared understanding of the damnation they were about to enter. Together they drank the bitter, burning liquid. He led her through the sterile expanse of the penthouse to his bedroom. The room was a void of shadow and muted color, dominated by an enormous, unadorned bed that seemed to float in the center of the space like a sacrificial altar. The cold, impersonal aesthetic was broken by a single, jarring detail. On the nightstand, a silver picture frame was turned face down, hiding its secret from the world. Clara knew with a sickening certainty that it held the face of his dead fiancé, the ghost that haunted every corner of this beautiful, empty kingdom. This was not a chamber of passion, it was a tomb, and her presence felt like a violation of his sacred private grief. The act she was about to commit felt less like a surrender of her body and more like a trespass upon his soul, a disturbance of a long-settled sorrow. The act of undressing was the longest, most agonizing journey of her life. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of not just fabric, but of her very self. With each piece of clothing that fell to the floor, she felt a part of the old Clara, the girl who believed in the sanctity of a soul-deep connection, fall away with it. He simply watched, his own suit jacket still perfectly in place, an impenetrable layer of armor. She stood before him in the dim, atmospheric light, her skin glowing pale, her vulnerability a tangible thing in the air between them. She was a work of art she had never allowed anyone to see, a masterpiece of fear and innocence, and she was now offering it up to be possessed by the one man who collected broken things. She closed her eyes, offering up a silent, desperate prayer for oblivion. When he finally moved, his approach was silent, his presence a sudden eclipse of the faint light from the window. His touch, when it came, was so contrary to her expectations that it shattered her composure. His fingertips, cool and firm, traced the delicate line of her collarbone, moving with the slow, reverent precision of a restorer, examining the fragile surface of a priceless canvas. There was no lust in the gesture, but a kind of awed, clinical curiosity. This unexpected gentleness was a cruelty far greater than any brutality could have been, for it made the transaction feel horrifyingly personal. It dissolved the wall of dissociation she had so carefully erected, and a single hot tear broke free, tracing a path of shame and sorrow down her temple. The business deal was dissolving into something far more complicated and painful. The physical act was a whisper, not a scream. It was a slow, quiet collision of his profound, unending grief and her desperate, terrified sacrifice. For Clara, it was a moment of complete fracture, her mind separating from the body she had offered up, floating somewhere near the ceiling as she watched the scene unfold below. But then, through the haze of her dissociation, she felt him change. His controlled, almost detached movements became rigid, his breath catching in a choked sob. He closed his eyes tightly, his face contorting not in pleasure, but in a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. She realized with a jolt of shocking clarity that he was not taking from her. He was trying to escape into her, to find a moment of release not from desire, but from a pain so deep it had hollowed him out completely. At the precipice, his control shattered entirely. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, his body racked with a shudder that had nothing to do with physical release and everything to do with emotional collapse. A low, guttural sound was torn from his throat, the sound of a soul breaking. In that instant, the impenetrable fortress of Damian Sterling was reduced to rubble, and all that was left was a broken man, clinging to the warmth of a stranger as if she were a lifeline in a cold, dark sea. He had taken her virginity, the tangible symbol of her carefully guarded self, but she, in her unwilling sacrifice, had inadvertently touched the core of his wound, a place of grief and guilt he had allowed no one to see for years. The exchange was complete, but the currency had been their souls. The silence that descended afterward was absolute, a heavy blanket woven from shame, grief, and the irrevocable consequences of their pact. He pulled away from her immediately, turning his back, the cool, distant billionaire already being painstakingly reassembled from the wreckage. Clara lay perfectly still, staring at the shadows dancing on the high ceiling, feeling a cold, cavernous emptiness inside her, where her most sacred principle used to be. The city lights outside seemed to mock her, a million indifferent eyes that had witnessed her fall. She had secured her brother's future, but the cost had been the utter annihilation of her own past and the woman she once was. The deal was done. The debt was paid. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the true reckoning had only just begun. The dawn that broke over Manhattan was a cold, indifferent grey. Clara woke with a start in the vast, silent bedroom, the sheets beside her already cool, as if he had never been there. The air was sterile, smelling only of expensive linen and the ghost of his cologne. A notification glowed on her phone screen, a sterile digital confirmation from a Swiss bank, a transfer of $750,000. It looked less like a number, and more like a brand seared onto her soul. A dull ache throbbed deep within her, a physical echo of the cavernous void that had been carved out where her identity used to reside. She gathered her discarded clothes, each piece feeling like a relic from another woman's life, and fled the beautiful empty tomb without a backward glance, the silence of the penthouse a far more damning judgment than any words could ever be. Damien stood behind the glass wall of his office, the city lights below, still glittering like a field of broken promises. He hadn't slept. The act, which he had intended as a cold clinical acquisition, had instead become an act of brutal self-revelation. Her quiet, terrified surrender had not felt like a victory. It had felt like a violation of something sacred, and in desecrating her he had only managed to excavate his own ancient, rotting grief. The ghost of her touch, the scent of her fear, the single tear that had traced a path down her temple, these sensations clung to him, a contamination his sterile world could not purge. A wave of self-loathing so potent it was nauseating washed over him. He had sought to possess a piece of untouched beauty, but he had only proven himself to be the monster in its story, a breaker of souls. The journey home on the pre-dawn subway was a descent into a different kind of hell. The train car, filled with the city's early risers and night shift workers, felt like a capsule of judgment. Every tired, indifferent glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, trying to shrink to become invisible, but she felt irrevocably marked, as if the night's transaction were written across her skin in invisible ink. When she finally unlocked the door to her apartment, the familiar scent of her mother's anxiety and the low hum of the refrigerator felt alien. This had been her life, her reality, but she no longer belonged to it. She was a ghost now, haunting the shell of a home she had sacrificed everything to protect, a stranger who wore her own face as a disguise. Her mother was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, her face etched with worry. The moment Clara walked in, Elena knew. She didn't know the details, but she saw the change, a new chilling stillness in her daughter's eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. When Clara announced, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, that the money for Matthew's treatment was secured, her mother's initial wave of tearful relief was immediately followed by a sharp, fearful question. "How, Clara? How did you do it?" Clara's vague, dismissive answer hung between them, a lie so heavy it poisoned the air. The suspicion in her mother's eyes was a mirror, reflecting back her own shame. It was the first consequence. The salvation she had bought had come at the cost of the fragile trust that had been the bedrock of their shared struggle. Sitting by Matthew's hospital bed later that day, holding his thin, warm hand, was an exercise in pure agony. He was awake, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks, already talking about the physics books he would read on the plane to Switzerland. His hope was a brilliant, painful light, and Clara felt she had no right to stand in its presence. Every ounce of her love for him was still there, a fierce, unwavering fire, but it was now choked by the smoke of her secret. She was the architect of his future, the provider of his miracle, but she felt like a fraud. She had saved his body by sacrificing the very part of her soul she had always believed made her worthy of his pure, uncomplicated love. The guilt was a physical pressure in her chest, making it difficult to breathe the same clean, hopeful air as him. Returning to the Sterling Arts Consortium was an impossibility. The moment she stepped into the climate-controlled silence of the restoration studio, the air felt thick with memory and shame. The half-finished portrait of the noblewoman on her easel seemed to stare at her with knowing, pitying eyes. Every tool, every jar of pigment was a reminder of the woman she had been, the focused, devoted professional whose hands were her only pride. Now those hands felt sullied. The space, once her sanctuary, had become the primary crime scene, and the ghost of his presence lingered in every corner. She couldn't stay. In the cold, impersonal light of the locker room, she typed a brief, formal resignation on her phone. It was an act of severance, a desperate attempt to amputate a part of her life that had become lethally toxic. The email landed in Damien's inbox with the quiet finality of a closing door. "I hereby tender my resignation, effective immediately." The words were stark, professional, and utterly devastating. He had on some level expected her to stay, for them to exist in the charged, impossible space they had created. Her departure was an unequivocal rejection, not just of the job, but of him and the vile pact they had made. A hot, unfamiliar surge of anger rose in his chest, followed by a profound, hollow ache. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. The transaction was complete. Yet, the knowledge that he would never again see her bent over a canvas, her focus an act of pure devotion, felt like a loss he hadn't factored into the price. He had bought her body, but she had escaped with her spirit, leaving him alone in his gilded cage, with nothing but the bill. In the weeks that followed, with Matthew safely in the care of the Swiss clinic, Clara found herself utterly adrift in a sea of empty time. The crushing purpose that had driven her every action, that had justified her ultimate sacrifice, was now an ocean away. She was left with only the aftermath. She wandered the city's streets for hours, a ghost in the bustling crowds, feeling profoundly disconnected from the vibrant, messy life flowing around her. The world seemed muted, its colors leached away, its sounds muffled. She would catch her reflection in a shop window and fail to recognize the woman staring back, a hollow-eyed stranger whose shoulders were slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. She feared that the transaction hadn't just taken something from her, it had broken her very ability to feel anything at all. One bleak afternoon, seeking refuge from a sudden downpour, she ducked into a small, forgotten art gallery. In a poorly lit corner, she found herself standing before a dark, tumultuous painting of a female martyr, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes blazing with an unbroken, defiant fire. Something in that gaze pierced through the thick fog of Clara's numbness. A feeling, hot and sharp, began to prickle beneath her skin. It was anger, a slow-burning rage at Damien, at the world's casual cruelty, at her own powerlessness. But then it morphed into something else, a fury at her own passive acceptance of victimhood. She had made a choice. It was a monstrous, soul-shattering choice, but it had been hers. She had walked into the fire, and she had not been entirely consumed. That grim realization was not a comfort, but it was a beginning. Miles away, in his silent penthouse, Damien was also a prisoner. He moved through his collection of perfect, beautiful things, but saw only flaws. The flawless surface of a sculpture reminded him of her skin. The deep, melancholic color of a painting reminded him of her eyes. He was haunted not by the ghost of his dead fiancée, but by the living ghost of the woman whose innocence he had so carelessly shattered. Her absence was a presence, a void that reshaped the very architecture of his solitude. In her small Queen's apartment, Clara took out a dusty sketchpad for the first time in a decade. Her hand, once so steady and precise, now moved with a raw, violent energy, filling the page with dark, angry strokes. They were two souls suffering in solitude, irrevocably bound by the toxic, unbreakable tether of the night that had ruined them both. 6 months had passed, a season of slow, painful healing. Matthew's emails from Switzerland were a lifeline, filled with the buoyant, intellectual energy that Clara had fought so desperately to save. He wrote of alpine air and complex equations, his words painting a picture of a future she had secured at an impossible price. Back in Queens, Clara had begun the quiet work of piecing herself back together. She took a job at a small community arts center, her days filled with the chaotic joy of children's finger paints and the smell of wet clay. It was a different kind of restoration, not of priceless artifacts, but of small, nascent spirits. The hollow space within her remained, but it was no longer a gaping void. It was a scar, a tender, permanent part of her new landscape, a testament to the fact that she had walked through fire and somehow, inexplicably, had not been entirely consumed by the flames. One rain-swept evening, while scrolling through an art blog on her phone, a headline caught her eye. The Sterling Arts Consortium was opening a new, highly anticipated public exhibition, Portraits of Resilience. Her breath hitched. There, in the center of the digital announcement, was the face of the 17th-century noblewoman, her melancholic gaze staring out from the screen. The accompanying text, written by an anonymous curator, spoke of the portrait as a study in quiet fortitude, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of profound loss. The words seemed to speak directly to her, a coded message from a past she had tried to bury. A powerful, undeniable urge took hold of her, a need to see the painting one last time, to stand before it not as a victim, but as a witness to her own survival. She chose a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the gallery hushed and sparsely populated, and then she saw it, isolated on a vast grey wall, illuminated by a single, perfectly aimed spotlight. It was more beautiful and more painful than she remembered. The noblewoman's gaze held a universe of sorrow, but Clara no longer saw a reflection of her own brokenness. Instead, she saw the layers of their shared history, the artist's love, the patron's grief, Damien's wound, and her own terrible sacrifice, all sealed beneath the final, flawless layer of varnish. It was a palimpsest of pain. She moved closer, her hand rising instinctively, her fingers hovering inches from the canvas in a phantom caress. In that moment, the painting ceased to be a symbol of her shame. It was simply a part of her story, a silent, beautiful witness to the price of a life. From the shadowed overlook of the gallery's second floor, Damien watched her. He had been there every day since the exhibition opened, a silent, solitary vigil. He saw her approach the canvas, and he saw the transformation. This was not the timid, self-effacing intern who had once worked for him. The woman below stood with a quiet, unshakable solidity, her shoulders no longer slumped. Under the weight of the world, he had curated this entire exhibition for this one singular purpose, as a desperate, unspoken apology. By framing the painting not as a possession, but as a symbol of resilience, he was trying to communicate the one thing he could never say aloud, that he saw her, truly saw her, not as a commodity he had purchased, but as a person of terrifying and beautiful strength who had shattered his cynical world. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, the faint prickle of being, observed, made Clara slowly turn and lift her gaze. Across the vast, silent atrium their eyes met. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in that charged space. The fear she had associated with his presence was gone, replaced by a calm, weary understanding. She looked at him and saw not a billionaire or a predator, but a man profoundly altered. The glacial coldness in his eyes had thawed, revealing the vast, desolate landscape of his grief. A wound, she now understood, was as deep as her own. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a greeting or a dismissal. It was a concession, an acknowledgement of their shared damnation, and in its quiet solemnity, it felt like an absolution. Clara held his gaze for a heart-stopping moment longer, before a small, sad smile touched her lips. She had her answer. Turning back to the painting for a final look, she then walked away, her steps echoing with a newfound purpose. She was not fleeing the gallery. She was simply leaving it behind. As she stepped out into the bright, indifferent light of the afternoon, she felt the sun on her face and knew she was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of her past. She was the restorer of her own life, and the meticulous, painful, and beautiful work was only just beginning. Their story was not a romance, but a crucible, and from its ashes, two separate souls began the slow journey back toward the light. If their journey has moved you, subscribe, like, and share their story, and let us know in the comments what you believe true resilience looks like.